She was only 6 years old, sleeping alone on a cold airport chair, clutching a backpack like it was her whole world, when a powerful millionaire CEO stopped in his tracks and heard her whisper in her sleep, "Mommy, don't go." He had no idea this lost little girl was about to shatter his pride, rewrite his past, and reveal a truth that could break, or save, his life. But why was she abandoned? And what secret did her mother hide that would change everything? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know something from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your part of the world? Your comments truly make this community feel like family, and I can't wait to read them. The airport pulsed with life, a restless river of humanity streaming in every direction, voices blending with the metallic echo of rolling suitcases and the sharp chime of flight announcements. But amid the storm of movement and noise, there was a stillness that drew the eye like a fragile candle flickering in the wind, and it was there, on a hard, cold bench pushed against a wall of glass where the night pressed in heavy and unforgiving, that a tiny 6-year-old girl lay curled into herself, her knees tucked close, her little pink shoes dangling just above the floor, her head resting not on the warmth of a parent's lap, but on a tattered backpack that seemed far too heavy for her small shoulders to ever carry, her breath shallow, lips trembling in uneasy sleep, as though even in her dreams she was not safe. Businessmen strode by without noticing, families rushed toward their gates, lovers reunited in embraces, yet no one paused long enough to wonder why such a fragile child was alone in the world's busiest place. No hand reached to cover her with a blanket, no familiar voice called her name. She was simply there, a silent question in a place that answered none, and in that moment fate itself conspired to bring into her orbit Ethan Cole, a man who had spent his 32 years building an empire in the skies, yet had forgotten how to look at the ground beneath his feet, his sharp suit perfectly pressed, his polished shoes tapping out a rhythm of confidence and power, his phone glowing with endless numbers, contracts, messages that confirmed his place at the top of the world. But when his stride brought him past that row of chairs, his steps faltered, his breath caught, and the heartbeat he had long ago trained to be steady in boardrooms and ruthless in negotiations, stumbled painfully inside his chest, for from that tiny body curled so tightly, a whisper escaped, a sound, so soft it should have been swallowed by the noise of the airport, but instead cut through every barrier around his soul, a plea no louder than a sigh, yet heavier than the weight of all his wealth. "Mommy, don't go." And the words did not belong to him, yet they pierced him with a force he could not explain. They reminded him of nights he had long buried, of choices he had convinced himself were right, of a love he had thrown away to feed his pride. And for the first time in years, the world around him blurred, the announcements faded, the footsteps dulled, and all that remained in his vision was the fragile rise and fall of a little girl's chest, as she clung in sleep to the hope that someone might still stay. And Ethan stood there, the millionaire airline boss feared by rivals and admired by investors, suddenly stripped of every illusion of control, standing not before a business opportunity, but before a mystery carved in the shape of a child. And he could not shake the question that clawed at his mind, the question that made his throat tighten and his hands tremble despite his efforts to stay composed. Why, in the midst of a crowded airport filled with strangers and families, was a child left so utterly, unbearably alone? Ethan lowered himself slowly, the polished shine of his shoes reflecting against the sterile airport floor as he crouched before the small figure curled tightly on the cold bench, and with a hesitation that felt foreign to a man used to commanding boardrooms, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the thin fabric of her sleeve, his voice breaking through the noise with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Hey, are you okay?" The child stirred, her lashes fluttering open as though torn from a dream too heavy for her fragile body, her wide eyes glassy with unshed tears as she blinked up at the stranger towering before her, and instinctively she pulled her tattered backpack closer, clutching it like a shield against a world that had already proven unsafe, her tiny knuckles whitening as if inside that worn bag lay the only pieces of her life she could still trust, while Ethan, a man who once dismissed emotions as weaknesses, found himself startled by the instinct to protect her, to fight against whatever invisible storm had pushed her here. Lowering his voice, he tried again, the stern edge long gone. Where's your family? And the question seemed to slice through her small defenses, for her lips trembled, her chest heaved, and in a voice that cracked under the weight of fear, she whispered words that no child should ever be forced to utter. My stepdad, he said he'd come back, but he didn't. And those words, fragile yet devastating, struck Ethan with a force far greater than the brutal battles of business he had always prided himself on winning, for here was not a deal lost, not a market collapsed, but a child betrayed, abandoned in the cruelest way, left in a crowd of strangers to wrestle with loneliness larger than herself. The confession replayed in his mind, echoing against memories he had long tried to silence, choices that had defined his past, choices where he too had walked away from someone who had once trusted him blindly, and as the little girl hugged her bag tighter, burying her face into it like a bird hiding from the storm, Ethan felt something burn in his chest, not anger at her stepfather alone, but anger at himself, at the man he had allowed pride and arrogance to shape. He straightened slightly, his jaw tightening, and with a sharp glance to his assistant, he gave an order that would have stunned any of his board members. Hold the boarding, cancel the flight if you must. His voice cold with authority, yet laced with urgency, a tone that admitted silently that this fragile moment mattered more than contracts waiting across the ocean, more than the investors expecting his presence, more than the entire empire that bore his name, for inside him pulsed a truth he could no longer ignore. That no victory in wealth could compare to the defeat staring at him in the form of a helpless child whose only crime was trusting adults who had failed her. His assistant, startled but obedient, hurried off to relay the command, leaving Ethan kneeling there, his powerful frame bent to the level of a girl who should have been held in arms of comfort, not left to the merciless hum of an airport. And for the first time in years, Ethan did not know what came next, did not know how to fix what lay before him. Yet he knew with every thud of his heart that walking away was no longer an option, not this time, not with this child, and as he studied her tear-streaked face, her shoulders shaking beneath the weight of loneliness too vast for 6 years to bear, a question loomed heavy in the air, gnawing at the edges of his conscience like a storm pressing at the glass walls of the terminal. Would anyone ever come back for her, or was she truly abandoned to face this world entirely on her own? The airport staff approached quickly, their polished shoes striking the glossy tiles with authority, clipboards and tablets in hand, their professional tones blending with the overhead announcements as they leaned toward the small girl, asking in turn for her name, her destination, her guardian. Their questions practiced yet powerless against the silence clinging to her fragile frame, and Lily, her little shoulders trembling beneath the weight of eyes staring down at her, gripped the faded strap of her backpack as though it were her anchor in a sea of strangers, her lips parting not with explanations or details, but with the same fractured plea that broke through the bustle of the terminal like glass under pressure. I want my mommy. She's sick. She needs me. And the words were not mere repetition but a cry from the depths of a child who did not understand paperwork, flight numbers, or policies. Only the sharp ache of separation, the fear of loss, the desperate yearning for the one figure who meant safety. Her voice quivered as though each word was stitched together with tears she refused to release, and the staff, trained for order and efficiency, exchanged helpless glances because there was no standard response for the rawness of abandonment, no script for comforting a little girl whose world was collapsing in silence. Ethan stood back, his tall frame casting a shadow over the scene, and though he had once prided himself on remaining detached, on observing chaos from a throne of calm control, he felt something fracture inside his chest, a sharp stab of memory pulling him back a decade, dragging him unwillingly to the sterile hallways of a hospital where fluorescent lights had hummed overhead, and where he had once paused outside a door that held Grace, the woman whose laughter had once lit up his world, whose touch had made him feel human in a life of numbers and power. And he remembered her eyes, pleading through tears, begging him to stay, to fight for them, but his pride, that cruel master, had whispered lies about dignity and ambition, convincing him that leaving was strength, when it was nothing but cowardice dressed in arrogance, and he had turned his back, choosing wealth over warmth, status over sacrifice, and in that single decision he had shattered the heart that had trusted him most. Now, standing in the crowded terminal years later, watching a child curl into herself, clutching her backpack as if her mother's love was trapped inside its frayed zippers, The echo of that night screamed inside him, louder than the announcements, louder than the footsteps, louder than reason itself, and his throat tightened with a guilt he thought buried, a regret that clawed mercilessly against the walls he had built. Lily's eyes darted up at the staff, wide and shining, and Ethan caught it then, the flicker of familiarity, the subtle tilt of her nose, the fragile set of her mouth when she whispered the word mommy. And it struck him not as coincidence, but as recognition, as though fate had painted traces of someone he once knew upon this small innocent face, and he found himself staring too long, breathing too shallow, his mind screaming questions he dared not speak aloud. Who was her mother? What story lived behind those fearful eyes, and why did this fragile girl stir in him a sense of déjà vu so sharp it was almost unbearable? The staff, still fumbling, tried to reassure her, promising to contact security, to search the passenger logs, but their voices seemed distant compared to the pounding in Ethan's chest, a relentless rhythm of truth pressing against denial, for as he watched Lily cling to her backpack and whisper again that her mother was sick, he felt the past colliding with the present, a collision he could no longer outrun, and though he told himself he was imagining the resemblance, that it was guilt playing tricks on his weary heart, the questions burned hotter with every second, leaving him no escape, no retreat, only the haunting certainty that this little girl was not just another abandoned passenger in his terminal, but the beginning of a truth that would unravel everything he thought he had secured. And as the staff turned toward him, expecting the CEO's command, expecting the decisive voice of the man who ruled airlines, Ethan remained silent, because deep inside he already knew the answer to the question echoing in his mind, an answer he could not yet face. Who was her mother, and why did she feel so unbearably, impossibly familiar? Ethan's heart thundered in his chest as though the world had caved in on itself, the sterile hum of the airport falling into a void of silence the instant the name left the child's lips, a name he had buried deep beneath years of pride and regret, a name that carried with it every sleepless night he had convinced himself he had moved on. Grace Parker, the woman he loved so fiercely and yet hurt so unforgivably, and as little Lily's trembling voice repeated it with innocent sincerity, Ethan felt his knees weaken, his vision blur, his breath stutter. For this wasn't just a coincidence, it was the universe tearing away his carefully built walls, forcing him to confront the past he had spent years escaping, and when he whispered the question about her father, dreading the answer before it came, the tiny girl dropped her gaze to her small fingers, twisting them nervously, and delivered the words like a knife through his chest, that her mother said he was too busy being rich to love them, words so devastatingly familiar to the guilt he carried that Ethan staggered backward as though physically struck, his composure cracking in full view of strangers, his mind spinning back to nights where Grace begged him to choose her over another deal, another contract, another empire-building moment, nights where he coldly walked away, convinced that success would justify everything. But now, standing before this child, her child, his child, the weight of his mistakes threatened to crush him. Flashes of Grace's smile haunted him, her laughter, the way she once believed in him before betrayal shattered her faith. And now this fragile girl with tear-streaked cheeks was living proof of the consequence he had never dared imagine. And as the realization struck deeper, Ethan struggled to breathe, questions flooding his mind in chaotic bursts. How had he not known? Where had Grace gone? What had she endured without him? And how had he allowed himself to become the very monster she must have described when explaining why her daughter's father was absent, and yet beneath the torment was a flicker of desperate hope, a whisper that perhaps it wasn't too late, that maybe Grace was still out there, that maybe he could make amends before life snatched away any chance of redemption. But staring at Lily, Ethan's voice faltered, his tongue heavy with unspoken truths, because how could he admit to this child that the man she despised was standing right before her? How could he confess to years of abandonment she didn't even fully understand? How could he face Grace again knowing the depth of the wound he had carved into her life? And as Lily clutched her backpack tighter, eyes brimming with fresh tears, Ethan felt something inside him fracture and reform at once, an unshakable resolve rising from the ruins of his past mistakes, a resolve that no empire, no wealth, no boardroom victory could ever satisfy compared to the chance of reclaiming what truly mattered. Yet the fear of rejection gnawed at him, the terror that Grace would never forgive, that she would shield Lily from him forever. And in that suffocating moment he realized his entire world had been redefined by a single name, a single truth, a single child who unknowingly mirrored his own eyes, and as he fought the urge to reach for her, to claim her as his, Ethan's mind screamed with one haunting certainty: Lily was his daughter, and nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan's heart pounded as though every beat was a hammer striking against years of guilt, and when his assistant's trembling voice confirmed that Grace Parker lay in a hospital bed fighting for her life, the weight of his past choices pressed down on him with suffocating force, each memory of his betrayal flashing like lightning in his mind, showing him the night he had walked out, the arguments fueled by his pride, the cold silence that followed, and the haunting look in her eyes that begged him to stay but which he ignored. And now, seeing her daughter clutching that worn-out backpack like it was her last thread of safety, he realized destiny had dragged him back to the very place he swore he'd never face again, a place where love and regret collided, and though his voice cracked as he promised Lily that he would take her to her mother, inside he was drowning in fear of rejection, terrified though, at Grace, the woman who once loved him with everything she had, would turn her fragile face away if she even managed to open her eyes, and as he scooped Lily into his arms, carrying her through the crowded terminal with urgency in his steps, the airport's chaos blurred into background noise, each passing second sharpening the knife of dread twisting inside his chest, because this was no ordinary reunion. It was a reckoning with his past sins, a desperate attempt to rewrite the ending of a story he once destroyed, and when his driver screeched to a halt at the hospital doors, Ethan leapt out, clutching Lily's small hand as though it were the only lifeline binding him to courage, his mind swirling with unanswered questions of how Grace had survived without him, what kind of pain she endured, and whether she had hated him all these years. But before he could take another breath, Lily's fragile voice pierced him again, whispering that her mommy was all she had and that she couldn't lose her too. Words that sliced through his resolve and left his eyes burning with tears he no longer cared to hide, and pushing past the sterile corridors that reeked of antiseptic and despair, he braced himself for the sight that awaited, every step heavier than the last, knowing this moment was both a chance for redemption and a punishment for his pride. And as he finally reached the door to Grace's room, his trembling hand hovered over the handle, torn between the need to rush inside and the terror of what he might find, his entire soul pleading silently for just one more chance. One chance to whisper apologies he should have spoken years ago. One chance to show her that he had finally chosen love over pride, even if it was already too late. Ethan stood frozen at the threshold, the sterile white corridor behind him fading into silence as his world narrowed to the frail figure on the hospital bed, a figure he had once called his forever, and the tiny girl clinging to her chest like the last fragment of hope she possessed. His chest burned with guilt as memories of slammed doors, RP words, and his blind obsession with money crashed over him like waves, drowning him in shame. Yet there was Grace, thinner than he remembered, her hair damp against the pillow, her lips pale but still shaping his name with a tremor that cut through every wall he had built, and for the first time in years his hands shook as he gripped the doorframe like a boy who'd lost his way home. Lily's eyes darted between them, innocent, confused, desperate, whispering, "Mommy, is he the man you told me about?" And Ethan's soul twisted at the weight of her question, because in that instant he saw himself through his daughter's eyes, not as a titan of industry, but as the man who had abandoned love, abandoned warmth, abandoned the very woman who had believed in him when the world had not. He stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Grace, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she existed. I thought walking away would keep you from my darkness, from my ambition, but I was wrong. I see it now." His words spilling like confessions at an altar, but Grace, weary and breathless, lifted her hand as if to stop him, her eyes shining with both anger and tears, whispering, "You left me when I begged you to stay. You chose wealth over my heartbeat, over our family, and now you come with promises. Do you know how many nights I told Lily stories to keep her from crying for a father who never came?" Her voice cracked, the sound splintering him deeper than any business failure ever could, and Ethan fell to his knees beside her bed, his expensive suit wrinkling, his pride dissolving as he pressed his forehead against the cold rail, whispering, "I was blind, Grace, but I can see now. Please, don't shut me out, let me be there, For her, for you, for whatever time we have left." And Lily, with trembling little hands, placed one on his shoulder, whispering, "Mommy, maybe he means it this time." Her voice, so pure, so full of hope it sliced through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Yet Grace's eyes brimmed with the war of love and betrayal, her frail chest rising unevenly as machines beeped in warning, and Ethan reached for her hand, his tears finally falling unchecked, whispering, "Don't forgive me today, don't trust me yet, just let me stay, let me prove I won't run this time." His heart begging while his lips trembled with fear that the only woman who had ever held his soul might take her last breath, still holding him as the man who broke her. Her silence stretched, fragile and infinite, until her lips parted, trembling not with surrender but with the question that would decide everything. Can a man who destroyed us once ever rebuild what's left? And in that suspended moment, the hospital room became the courtroom of his life, and only Grace held the verdict. Would her weakening heart allow even a sliver of trust, or was this reunion already too late? Ethan's voice cracked as the confession left his lips, echoing heavier than any speech he'd ever given to shareholders, trembling not with authority, but with desperation. His head bowed low beside Grace's frail frame, his hand clinging to Lily's as though it were the last tether binding him to humanity itself, while Grace's weary eyes softened yet flickered with doubt, every blink carrying memories of nights she had held their daughter alone, of the countless storms she had weathered without his arms, of the quiet tears shed into pillows when pride had stolen the man she once believed in, and though her chest rose shallowly with each breath, there was fire in her voice when she whispered, "Words are easy, Ethan, but where were you when the hospital bills piled, when Lily cried herself to sleep asking why her father didn't love her, when I was too weak to get out of bed yet forced to smile so she wouldn't break?" Each syllable striking him like hammer blows, shattering the illusion of redemption he thought a simple vow could grant, yet he didn't flinch. He absorbed it because it was truth, the key, and of truth he had denied for too long, and with trembling lips he answered, "I was a coward, Grace, hiding behind the empire I built, mistaking fear for strength, but I see now. I don't want to win boardrooms if it means losing my family. I don't care if the world calls me powerful if my daughter calls me a stranger. I am done running." His body trembling with sincerity as he pressed Lily's hand to his heart, whispering, "Feel it, sweetheart. This beat is yours. It should have been yours from the beginning." And the little girl, eyes brimming with tears yet filled with a flicker of wonder, leaned against him hesitantly, whispering, "Mommy, he feels warm." Her innocence slicing through the bitterness like dawn breaking over night, and Grace's lips trembled at the sight of father and daughter touching for the first time with truth unveiled, a picture so fragile it made her ache, but she guarded her heart still, murmuring, "Don't promise what you can't keep, Ethan, because this little soul has already survived enough disappointment to last a lifetime." And he, broken yet resolute, lifted his face, his eyes wet but unwavering, whispering, "Then let me show you, Grace. Not through words, but through every choice I make from this moment on, let me earn the right to stand beside her bed when she dreams, beside you when you fight for breath, let me rewrite the story I ruined." And the room fell into silence, broken only by the steady beep of monitors and the sound of a grown man's sobs merging with the faint whimper of a child who had unknowingly found her father, until Lily, with hands so small yet carrying the weight of their fractured family, pulled Grace's frail fingers toward Ethan's trembling ones, pressing them together and whispering with the purity of faith only a child could hold, "Maybe we can be a family now." Her words hovering like fragile wings above the ruins of broken trust, forcing Grace to close her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks, torn between the ache of betrayal and the miracle of this moment, while Ethan, kneeling like a penitent, realized the greatest wealth he could ever hold was in the fragile grasp of the two souls before him, and as the clock ticked mercilessly on, the question hung heavy, stretching into every heartbeat. Was this moment the beginning of forgiveness, or the cruel reminder that time might run out before it could bloom? Grace's tears carried both longing and fear. Would she give Ethan a second chance, or would life's clock strike too late for redemption? Grace's faint smile lingered through the pain, her tear sliding like a ribbon of truth down her cheek, her voice carrying the frail strength of a woman who had endured storms alone. "Then prove it, Ethan. Not with money, with love." Those words struck deeper than any accusation, because they were not about vengeance, but about redemption. And in that moment, Ethan bent low, kissing Lily's forehead with trembling reverence, whispering, "You're my true wealth. Both of you," as though sealing a vow not with signatures or contracts, but with his own heartbeat. Lily's tiny arms wrapped around his neck, clinging as if she had finally found the missing half of her soul, and Grace's weary eyes softened, the bitterness of years warring with the warmth of seeing her child complete for the first time, while Ethan, broken in pride but reborn in spirit, let the tears he had buried behind boardrooms and bravado flow freely, washing away the cold armor of a man who once believed skyscrapers defined him, only to discover in this fragile hospital room that love was the only empire worth building. The machines hummed around them, steady and unrelenting, but for the first time their rhythm didn't signal fear, it underscored hope, a fragile melody threading itself into the silence as Grace reached out her weak hand, not to scold, not to strike, but to rest upon his trembling one, whispering with the last of her strength, "If you mean it, Ethan, show her every day. Vow. Don't let her grow up thinking love can leave." And his hand closed over hers with fierce gentleness, his lips trembling as he answered, "I will spend every breath I have left proving it, Grace, to her, to you, to myself." And Lily, sensing the weight of promises too heavy for her small shoulders, lifted her tear-bright face and whispered the simplest, purest truth, "Now, I'm not alone anymore." Words so soft yet so powerful they seemed to echo through the sterile walls, weaving a new story from the ruins of the old. Ethan bowed his head against his daughter's hair, inhaling the scent of innocence he had nearly lost forever, and in that surrender, the cold millionaire ceased to exist, replaced by a man who finally understood that power is nothing without people to protect, wealth is hollow without hearts to share it with, and pride is a prison until love breaks it open. Grace closed her eyes, not in defeat but in fragile peace, knowing that for the first time in years, her little girl's future would not be written in loneliness but in the joined hands now resting around her. And as sunlight broke through the hospital blinds, painting them in gold, it became clear. Humanity had triumphed over pride, a child's innocence had healed a broken man, and kindness had rewritten the fate of a family that once lay in ruins. In the end, it wasn't power, money, or success that defined Ethan Cole. It was the moment his daughter's whisper turned his empire of glass into a fortress of love. Humanity won, family was restored, and a little girl's faith lit the way home.